Travel reimbursement forms. I just want to show you.
That is so classic.
So I gotta get my dance.
That's my motto.
So you guys can do it this way.
Just remind me.
Just fill it.
And so it's
Jim.
Adrian,
Good morning.
Good morning.
How are you? I'm good.
in return of this
I have a chronic problem with losing things.
which
And
is
I literally lost my wallet that I paid for last night. I'll find it. Either Justin Saltgrass has it or it fell out of my purse in my house.
Okay.
And my purse is in it.
okay.
Steve,
I'll find it.
you
As
ready?
long as it supports game.
We could come to order for our second day of our March Parks and Wildlife Commission meeting. Welcome to everyone from the public and to staff and to my fellow commissioners. Our first item on the agenda is from Mr. Cooley. Would you mind telling me just the process here on who goes first and all that? I apologize. I should know that.
Well, and I suppose I should too. I don't know if there's necessarily a formal process. The way we've done it in the past, if it's okay with the commission, I would just like to present a basic brief of facts, and then I'll go ahead and turn it over to the attorney for Mr. Wakuda, Jeff Whedon, allow him to present his arguments, and I'd just like a few minutes to summarize at the end on how I made my decision.
Very good. I appreciate you reminding me. Thanks very much.
Hope it works. Good morning, Chairman Howard, Director Broscheid, commissioners. Again, my name is Steve Cooley. I'm the State Hearing Examiner for Colorado Parks and Wildlife Commission. Mr. Tim Wakuda has requested the Commission to review his initial suspension decision of 3 years, which came as a result of unlawfully entering upon private land to fish without permission. A brief background on the case is that on March 4th, 2016, Colorado Wildlife Officer Rachel Serrala received information about a fishing trespass on the Blue River. Josh Reichert of the Blue River Ranch, or BVR, called to report that he had witnessed 2 men trespassing on the BVR and fishing near a bridge on the Blue River. The trespass had occurred in an area for boaters to put in or take out of the river. This access has been granted by the landowner as a courtesy, but no fishing is allowed at the boater access area. There are signs at the bridge indicating that it is strictly for boating access only. Officer Serrala responded to the area and contacted one of the trespassers, Joseph Canepa, carrying a fishing rod and carrying a can of beer. Officer Serrala could smell a strong odor of alcohol on Canepa, and he appeared to be intoxicated. Canepa told the officer that he had been fishing near the bridge with his friend Tim Wakuda, who lived in the BVR subdivision. Canepa was otherwise uncooperative or inebriated to the point he was not able to communicate effectively with the officer. Officer Serrala then met with the ranch manager, Josh Reichert, who said that he had yelled over to the Wakuda and Canepa and told them they were trespassing and couldn't fish there. Reichert described Wakuda as argumentative and belligerent, and at one point asking Reichert to come under the bridge in an attempt to instigate a fight. When Reichert returned to his vehicle to report the incident, Wakuda approached his vehicle and asked if Reichert lived at the house by the bridge on the river. Reichert said that he did, and then Wakuda got back into his vehicle and left, leaving his fishing companion Canepa at the bridge. Wakuda's reaction concerned Reichert because trespassers are usually cooperative and leave once they've been told they can't fish there. Officer Serrala gave Canepa a ride to Wakuda's residence where she met Mr. Wakuda. He did also smell strongly of alcohol and admitted to having a few rum and cokes when asked by the officer if he had been drinking. Officer Serrala explained that she was there investigating a trespassing complaint and requested Wakuda's identification. He did not comply with the officer's request. Instead, he pulled out his cell phone, stating he wanted to record the contact. Wakuda was uncooperative and at one point told Officer Serrala that she was cute, to which the officer replied that she did not appreciate the comment. Wakuda became upset that the officer was on his property and told her to leave. Officer Sarala described Wakuda as intently staring at her and making statements that he had police friends. Wakuda failed to comply with any of the officer's requests and behaved in an erratic, agitated manner. The officer, concerned for her own safety, if the contact continued, chose to leave the residence and attempt to contact Mr. Wakuda at a later time. As Officer Sarala was leaving, Canepa said the entire incident was embarrassing. Officer Sarala returned to the residence, and with Colorado State Patrol Trooper Gingles, they attempted to recontact Mr. Wakuda. Although an individual could be seen peeking through the blinds, no one would answer the door. Officer Sarala's supervisor, Lyle Seidner, also arrived on scene, and the decision was made to leave the residence for the officer's safety, all of the officer's safety, and so as not to escalate the situation any further. Early the following morning, Officer Sarala went to Wakuda's residence, but his vehicle was gone. About the same time, Officer Sarala received information that a tire had been shot out on the ranch manager, Josh Reichert's vehicle. While investigating this incident, Officer Sarala received information that Wakuda's vehicle was back at his residence and responded there. When she arrived, Wakuda had already left, but she encountered Wakuda's vehicle driving in the area. Officer Sarala attempted to stop Wakuda as he approached by activating her emergency red and blue lights. He did not stop and continued on. Officer Sarala turned around and activated her siren on her patrol vehicle. Wakuda then turned onto Highway 9 before finally pulling over to the shoulder of the highway. Officer Sarala approached and requested Wakuda's identification, but again he did not comply. Instead, he yelled at his passenger, Joseph Canepa, to get out his phone and record the incident before producing the requested identification. Wakuda told the officer that she needed to contact Colorado Parks and Wildlife lead law enforcement investigator Bob Thompson, and that he would tell her she was wrong. Wakuda was pacing around outside of the vehicle, yelling and continuing to be argumentative and agitated. Wakuda expressed disbelief that this was all over a fishing incident, repeatedly stating that it was ridiculous and crazy. When Wakuda's behavior did not de-escalate, Officer Sarala placed him in handcuffs for her safety and awaited for additional officers. Officer Sarala had Canepa stay outside the vehicle while she attempted to question him, and Wakuda told him not to answer any of the questions. Additional officers arrived to assist Officer Sarala. Canepa admitted that he and Wakuda had been drinking Bloody Marys that morning as they were driving around. When questioned about Reichert's tire being shot out, Wakuda said that no one was in danger of being hurt from the tire being shot, but he did not admit that he had been the person that shot the tire, and no charges were brought in regards to that incident. Before being released, Wakuda did apologize for how he had handled the incident. Mr. Wakuda was cited for unlawfully entering upon private land to fish without permission and unlawfully possessing an open alcoholic beverage in a motor vehicle. Mr. Wakuda has acknowledged guilt to these charges by a payment of $206 and a fine and assessed 20 license suspension points. I'll go ahead and turn it over to Mr. Whedon at this point.
Thank you, Mr. Whedon. Please proceed.
Mr. Chairman, ladies and gentlemen of the Commission, thank you for the opportunity to speak with you briefly here today. I was briefed on the procedure a little bit earlier as well, and I thank State Hearing Examiner Cooley for helping us out in that regard and throughout the case. I will keep this relatively brief, and then Mr. Wakuda was hoping to make a very brief statement in front of the Commission as well, and of course we could answer any questions or concerns that the Commission had. Mr. Wakuda was found guilty of fishing trespass, and that's the issue we're here before you today. One correction in my report is that he has not hunted and fished actually only from the suspension date. There was a statement that said it had been from the original, the March 4th, 2016, but it's been a years that he has voluntarily not hunted or fished since the incident. And he wanted to do that as a show of good faith, to be able to show that he is a good sportsman and can abide by the rules. The heart of what we're here before you today, ladies and gentlemen, is just a issue regarding fundamental fairness and keeping things consistent regarding fishing trespass issues. We had requested all the recent similar suspension decisions for 20 points for fishing trespass via a Cora request in the office, and Mr. Cooley's office and Ms. Varney were very, very helpful in being able to get us those 6 cases that are recent cases. All of these cases resulted in either a 1-year suspension or no suspension at all. And I have a table in my report that I'm sure you guys have been able to take a look at. But it was 3 1-year suspensions, and those were oftentimes where fish were taken, and then no suspension. And in this case, it's important to note, Your Honor, that everyone here, that no wildlife was harmed, and there was nothing willful or wanton about the fishing trespass. And so our suggestion is that, especially in light of the 1 year that he's already essentially served voluntarily, that there should be no suspension in this case. There was a lot of conduct in this case that is troubling and difficult, and Mr. Wakuda will talk about that as well. He should have been far more respectful and far more thoughtful and far more responsive, and he'll speak a little bit to that. But thankfully, there was no charged conduct regarding that. There was no convictions. There was not even any charges made. And that doesn't diminish what happened, but it does put in context that we are here on a fishing trespass issue. And that he, in that situation, he received a suspension at least 3 times longer, 300% more, than even the most serious of the other suspensions regarding fishing trespass. Mr. Wakuda has a lack of any significant criminal history and any recent wildlife violations. He's been a responsible, lifelong sportsman and is very remorseful and is mortified to be here in front of you today, and will be able to express that to you himself. The other thing is that he's been able to learn some very, very valuable lessons and use that to be able to change the conduct that day, which was out of his character. This was an area where he had spent more than 15 years fishing before then, with his kids and with other people. And again, there was an easement to be able to put watercraft into the water there. But it turns out that there was a dispute about whether or not he was able to fish there. And they all reacted very, very poorly to, at that point in time, being told he's an owner in the area, thought he had an easement and a right to be in that area, and was indignant about the fact that he felt he had that, but it turns out that that was in conflict, and that's what led to the fishing trespass. Also, again, to reiterate, Mr. Wakuda's trespass, while acknowledged now, was neither knowing nor intentional, and importantly, no wildlife was taken or harmed. No wildlife was taken or harmed. And materially, and further mitigation regarding to your procedural rules, the violations did not result in the taking of wildlife, injury or death of a person, or damage or destruction of public or private property. There was a single violation. The incident did not involve species listed as endangered, threatened, or of special concern, nor did it involve trophy wildlife. The violation did not show any intentional, knowing, or negligent disregard of wildlife or public safety. The violation was not intentional, knowing, or negligent action on behalf of Mr. Wakuda. He had no prior license suspensions. The violation did not occur while Mr. Wakuda was subject to a prior suspension or otherwise unlicensed. The violation did not involve any assault or threat to any resisting a police officer. The violation did not involve any specified illegal manner used to take, for example, the use of bait, traps, snares, poison, etc. He welcomes the opportunity to be in front of this commission and answer any questions or concerns to what was a concerning incident. But, ladies and gentlemen, what was a fishing trespass incident? And which, you look at all the public records, there's not been a single suspension that was more than a single year. So, barring any questions from the commission, Your Honor, Mr. Wakuda was hoping to make a brief statement, and then we can let Mr. Cooley go ahead and summarize and handle any questions or concerns the commission might have.
That's fine. Mr. Wakuda, if you'd like to come forward, please.
Thank you, Mr. Commissioner.
I'd like to say thank you, Commission, for listening to me. I appreciate that. First of all, I'd like to apologize for the way I acted that day. It was way out of character for me. If I can just briefly say, the evening before, one of my hunting dogs died in my lap for about 3 hours. So I was a little out of character that day. No, that's no reason for my actions, though. I just wanted to say that. I have been fishing at this location for about the last 15 years. I'm a homeowner in Blue Valley Acres, which gives me about 3/4 of a mile of easement to fish on the one side of the river, and on this easement was on the other side of the river by the bridge. It's about 40 yards of easement. It said kayak takeout was the only sign that was on this easement. I assumed it was part of my easement. Since I've been fishing there for 15 years, no one's ever harassed me down there before. No one's ever said anything to me before. I've taken my son, my children. I've got 2 girls as well. We've been down there fishing for a long time. I've seen the rancher that lived in the house across the street from where I was fishing. I've seen him before. He's waved at me before. I couldn't understand why this rancher, I understand it's a different rancher. I talked to some homeowner, a friend of mine in the neighborhood, and he said, well, this guy, you know, he's not the same guy that's been living in that house. So that kind of really threw me off why he came over to me and started, you know, telling I was trespassing. That person has waved to me in the past. So that's pretty much what I wanted to say is what I did. I wasn't willfully trespassing. I really thought it was private my easement. I was really surprised when the rancher came down and started yelling at me about trespassing. I basically acted out of character, and I really apologize for that. I have a 16-year-old son right now who, when he was 14, got his hunter safety license. Last year, I was not able to hunt with him or fish with him. I've got 2 girls that are 14 right now. They both have fishing poles with their names on them. They did not fish with me last year either. I would really like to be able to enjoy those activities with my children. I really feel like that's important. My father did that with me. So thanks for listening to me. Did you guys have any questions for me?
Mr. Wakuda, why don't we let Mr. Cooley do his follow-up, and then I'll open it up for the commission to ask questions of all of you, if that's okay.
Yes, thank you.
Excuse me. Mr. Wakuda's 3-year suspension is based on his 2016 wildlife conviction, as well as a 1996 wildlife conviction for unlawfully entering upon private land to hunt wildlife without permission and unlawful possession of big game, as well as the seriousness of his actions and his behavior in the 2016 incident. The officer and the ranch manager for the BVR felt so strongly about this case, they actually drove down here today and are present in this case as well if you have any questions for them. This is not an opportunity to necessarily relitigate the facts underlying the case. Mr. Wakuda has pled guilty to it, has not objected to the officer's case report or any of the facts underlying in there. I fully recognize that a 3-year suspension is not typical for a single wildlife violation involving a fishing trespass. However, there are concerning aggravating factors in Mr. Wakuda's case that justify such a suspension. His repeated erratic and belligerent behavior towards the property manager and the wildlife officer, his refusal to comply with the wildlife officer's request, and the inappropriate comment made to the officer that she was cute. He does have the one previous wildlife violation that involved a trespass that was similar. And in an intensive search of the previous wildlife records, honestly, I couldn't find another trespassing case that resulted in a 3-year suspension. But it is not accurate to compare other trespassing cases that do not involve these aggravators. They are simply too dissimilar to warrant a comparison of a length of suspension alone. Not all behaviors or actions rise to the level of a criminal act, nor should they. However, actions and behaviors can be considered when determining the length of a wildlife suspension, both as aggravating factors as well as mitigating factors. In regards to Mr. Wakuda's behavior towards the property manager, Josh Reichert, when Mr. Wakuda was originally told to leave by Mr. Reichert because he was trespassing, he reacted by challenging the property manager to some sort of an altercation under the bridge. Following this, Mr. Wakuda approached Mr. Reichert's vehicle to confront him about where he lived. This left the property manager feeling uneasy about Mr. Wakuda's behavior. So this is not simply one instance of erratic, agitated, aggressive behavior towards one person. This went on for 2 days, over 3 instances with both the property manager as well as the wildlife officer. Ultimately, it resulted in Mr. Wakuda being put in handcuffs for the officer's own safety. So, you know, I don't feel that it's fair to necessarily characterize this as simply a fishing trespass. In regards to the self-imposed suspension, his hearing was on March 21st, 2017. He has since purchased 5 different opportunities of a privilege of a license. He purchased an annual fishing license on March 30th, as well as an extra rod stamp and a habitat stamp. And then he also applied in the 2017 limited deer application and elk application. First choice was for a preference point. So while he may not have actively hunted or fished, he certainly has exercised the privilege of being able to apply for licenses. And he has not been suspended. He's currently on a stay pending the outcome of his appeal today. With the exception of an actual physical assault on a wildlife officer or landowner, I can't say anything else than Mr. Wakuta's case is among the most serious and egregious that I've seen or that I've been able to research in previous hearing examiners' cases. I would respectfully request that the Commission uphold the initial 3-year suspension decision based on the facts presented. I'll go ahead and stay up here in case they have any questions for myself.
Gentlemen, the way we'll proceed then is I'll open this up for questions and comments from the commissioners. And if you would just let me recognize you when you respond, if you get a chance to respond, just so the record's clear. Commissioners, any questions or comments? Commissioner McDaniel.
Question for Mr. Cooley. You mentioned in the trespass cases you didn't find any that were longer. So what typically would result in a longer suspension period? Kind of offense different than trespass that would result in 5 or 3 or 4 or 5 or longer suspension?
Mr. Cooley.
So I can kind of put it into context, your statement.
Absolutely. The factors that would result in a longer suspension would certainly be the conduct of the individual, cooperation, hindering the investigation, any previous wildlife violations or suspensions, and those are the ones that I found in this case that resulted in a more lengthy suspension. Specifically, this was not one instance of hindering the investigation or being uncooperative. It was repeated behavior over the course of 2 days that didn't change and quite frankly just continued to escalate.
Commissioner Zimmerman.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm not sure who this question is for, but my question is, if you have a fishing or a suspension and you can't engage in fishing and hunting, this is going to sound like a silly question, but can you still go? I mean, I do think it's important. Obviously, we talk about recruitment all the time. I do think it's important to go out with your children, but can you not still go fishing and just not necessarily cast to fish and still be on the river with your children? And can you not still go out in the woods and take your children hunting without actually firing a shot? Is that, or are you like, does the suspension mean you cannot go out and engage in these activities in any form?
Mr. Cooley.
Thank you. It does not prohibit a person from being in the field with their children or anybody else for that matter. They simply cannot be the one that purchases a license, and they cannot be the one actively fishing or hunting.
Mr. Whedon.
Just briefly, I don't disagree at all with what State Hearing Examiner Cooley, I'm sorry, I don't disagree with what State Hearing Examiner Cooley said, other than the fact that it winds up being a bit of a functional prohibition. Because if you are in hunt camp or you're fishing and someone hands you a rod, or you wind up holding a fish, or if something was illegally or improperly taken and you wind up being a part of that, it winds up being very, very difficult. So it's a bit fraught with peril if you're under suspension to be in those areas, but I think technically you're exactly right, that you can go along, and as long as nothing goes wrong, everything's going to be fine.
Mr. Spahar, Commissioner Spahar.
Mr. Cooley, in the transcript of the hearing, in the introductory part of it, you mentioned a number of different factors, I think 17 in total, that you can consider when making a suspension. Without having to do the litany of all 17, what are the kind of factors that under our rules and regulations you consider in your suspension decisions?
Well, without specifically addressing the table, the ones I would look at in this case that applied would have been the previous wildlife conviction. So, you know, being subject to a previous suspension or wildlife violations, hindering the investigation, and whether or not there was any threat to public safety in this case, or threat to a wildlife officer. I don't feel that a person necessarily needs to say, "I am going to harm you," to be a threat to a wildlife officer or necessarily put hands on them. I think his behavior clearly demonstrated the fact that he was a threat not only to public safety but also to the wildlife officer.
Okay. Thank you.
Commissioner Peisel.
This seems very serious to me. Honestly, if I had the power to give you a stiffer sentence, I would do that. If we were legally allowed to give you this severe of a sentence, then I'm going to make a motion to deny the appeal.
I'll second.
Second from Commissioner Bray. Any further discussion? Adrian, would you please call the roll?
Actually,
Oh, Commissioner Zip.
I just wanted to make one comment that, Mr. Cooley, what I heard from you was excuses on how this happened and why. I didn't see any remorse. I didn't hear any apology today. I just heard explanations for why it happened. So I just wanted to make that statement. That's it.
Okay, Mr. Whedon, if you'd like to make a comment.
Well, and I certainly respect that from Commissioner Zip. The commission was able to hear both me and Mr. Wakuda. We both expressly and impliedly apologize to this commission for his conduct. So I'm sorry that that's the message you heard, but the words that we spoke were of an apology, and you did hear that today from both of us.
Commissioner Spahar.
Just a comment before we vote. I mean, I'm willing to accept the explanation that this was uncharacteristic behavior. It doesn't mean that there shouldn't be consequences for this sort of behavior, and I think, as Commissioner Peisel has mentioned, I think this is a level of activity over an extended period of time, over a couple of days, that deserves a serious consequence.
Any further discussion? Adrian, please call the roll.
Bray?
Yes.
Haskett? Hauser?
Yes.
McDaniel? Yes. Peisel? Yes. Spahar?
Yes.
Vigil?
Yes.
Wingfield?
Yes.
Zimmerman?
Yes.
Zip?
Yes.
And Chairman Howard.
Yes.
Motion carries unanimously.
Thank you, gentlemen.
Thanks to the commission.
Adrian, I think I have the old agenda. So who's next?
Yeah, and he's got two of them.
Oh, he's got two.
Steve will introduce it.
Okay. Very good. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Cooley. Why don't we go with the next case, please?
Okay. We do have two additional appeals. However, these will be intertwined a little bit. I want to recognize that they're certainly separate cases. However, the underlying facts are going to remain the same in them. So in the interest of time, I'm not going to repeat the underlying facts of the investigation twice. Again, I would like to go ahead and offer a brief background on this case. I'll go ahead and turn it over to Mr. Gilbert, present his arguments, and I'll go ahead and summarize how I arrived at the decision that I did. On December 24th, 2016, Eston McGraw, Winston McGraw, and 4 other individuals were hunting waterfowl from a box blind along the South Platte River in Weld County. The group had permission to hunt the private land belonging to River Bottom Hunt Club. Jarrett McGraw, Eston and Winston's father, is part owner of the River Bottom Hunt Club. The McGraws had set the box blind on land belonging to a neighbor, Esther Shank. Shank's daughter, Constance Nelson, and Larry Nelson contacted the hunters while driving the land with their dogs. The Nelsons told the hunters that they were on their private land owned by Shank and not the River Bottom Hunt Club, as the hunters believed. When Larry Nelson was talking to the hunters, someone in the group, in a voice loud enough to be heard across the river and by Nelson, said, and I'll loosely quote here, I don't know if this is verbatim, said that he was being, and pardon the language, but that he was being ballsy to come and ask them to leave when the hunters were the ones with the guns. The Nelsons left the group of hunters. but the hunters did not leave Nelson's property, and the Nelsons contacted Colorado Wildlife Officer Michael Grooms. The Nelsons told the officer that the hunters had made a threatening statement towards the Nelsons, and that the Nelsons had been told to keep their dogs away because it was wrecking the hunters' hunt. The Nelsons were upset that the hunter had not left when asked to do so, and requested that all hunters be prosecuted for the trespass. Officer Grooms investigated the reported trespass, and although the hunters were not present at that time, he did find that the box blind was set about 0.02 miles, or about 35 yards, onto the Shank property. On December 31st, Officer Grooms returned to the site where the box blind was set and observed that the hunters and observed the hunters prior to contacting them. During his observations, Wildlife Officer Grooms observed Eston McGraw shoot and kill a common merganser. Officer Grooms then contacted the group of waterfowl hunters, Eston McGraw, Winston McGraw, and the 4 others, and noted that the box blind had not been moved since the original trespassing complaint was filed. During his inspection of licenses and ammunition and shotguns, Officer Grooms discovered that Eston McGraw had an illegal shotgun that held more than 3 shells. Also did not possess a 2016 small game hunting license, and ultimately was charged with 4 different violations for the trespass, the illegal shotgun, the illegal merganser, and not having a proper and valid 2016 hunting license. And then Winston McGraw, given the same facts underlying the case, was issued a trespassing citation. And both parties did plead guilty by payment of their respective charges. I'll go ahead and turn it over to Mr. Gilbert at this point.
Thank you, Mr. Cooley. Mr. Gilbert.
Thank you. Good morning. My name is Nate Gilbert. I represent Eston and Winston McGraw, who appear today with their father. I'm not going to go into the factual background. I think Mr. Cooley has given an adequate summation. There are a couple things that I will point out. The idea here, I think what it comes down to is what keeps coming up, I should say, is the statement made allegedly by one of the hunters in a box blind containing 6 hunters. The complaining witness, Ms. Nelson, was unable to determine who it was made by, and there was no evidence that it was actually made. Much less to say that it was actually made by Eston or Winston McGraw. I think it's improper to consider that statement when deciding if these 2 individuals should be suspended when there were 4 other individuals involved. Because there was not any kind of hearing, determination, this was never proven to actually have happened, and to consider it when deciding if Mr. McGraw, either Mr. McGraw should be suspended and for how long is an improper consideration. That being said, I will go into a couple of things here today. As you heard from Mr. Cooley, Eston was suspended for 2 years and Winston suspended for 1 year. Surprisingly, the gentleman before, and I don't wish to throw anybody under the bus or make it seem like we just kind of thought we'd come today and see what happens, but it is striking to me that the gentleman before was suspended for 1 additional year in consideration to Eston's 2-year suspension for the events that occurred. Eston and Winston built a box blind, taking one of their school breaks to do so. They then placed the blind on what they believed to be the property of the River Bottom Hunt Club. When they placed that blind there, apparently it was 35 yards off. 35 yards, not that they saw a bunch of ducks, they crossed a boundary and shot all the ducks there knowing that they were on private property. They were supposed to be on property 35 yards away. They made a mistake based on that. Throughout the case and the narrative statement by the officer, the recurring theme and additionally that happened during the CPW hearing was that they didn't use a GPS and they didn't use onX maps. Something that I've seen come up again and again in Colorado Parks and Wildlife cases is this onX maps. onX maps are great, but unless the commission is willing to state that, 100% if you don't use an onX map or you don't use this particular brand of GPS topo mapping, you're not doing enough, I don't think it's fair to consider that as far as what these gentlemen did. When they were confronted by the landowners, they actually took down a map, went online, printed off on the assessor's website, got the property lines, walked down along the river, and determined that they were on their property. They were wrong, sure, but to say that because they didn't use this private company's product and CPW requires that to happen, again, I think it's unfair to say that. So a suspension should not be seen as something automatic, and thus the burden is on the individual to say this should not be suspended. More accurately, the Commission's position, I don't think, should not be that simply accumulating 20 or more points should be an automatic suspension. Eston received a suspension 1 year longer than his brother Winston, 2 years for his. The additional violations that we're adding on for the additional year apparently are forgetting to buy a small game license and not having a plug in his shotgun, therefore making it an illegal weapon for duck hunting. I think what's missing from that particular statement is the fact that his shotgun did not have 3 or more shells in it, that he was observing that idea. It's just kind of an automatic thing when you're duck hunting. If you've been doing it long enough, you load it with 3 shells. He forgot to have the plug in the gun. It's a mistake, it happens. However, he only had 3 shells in the firearm and had steel shot. So this wasn't a cascading thing where it was guys going off shooting lead at ducks with unplugged shotguns. Additionally, he had every other license as required for waterfowl hunting. I don't think that the Commission is ready to make the statement that he was attempting to defraud the state out of the $15, $20 license fee for a small game license, but he bought his state waterfowl stamp, his federal waterfowl stamp, his general hunting license, habitat stamp, everything else that would go for this kind of thing. I mean, it was honestly just something that didn't get put on the long list of things that you go to Walmart or you go to Dick's or you go to the CPW office and they print you off. One thing got left off of there. It's a general mistake. It happens. It should not have happened. And Eston has taken full responsibility for it. Touching on the responsibility part of it, that was the entire theme of their interaction with the officers. You'll notice completely absent from the report is any indication that Eston, Winston, or anyone in the group gave any kind of resistance to the officer. When the officer approached them, they handed over everything they were supposed to. They immediately complied with every direction they were given by the law enforcement officer and were generally cooperative. It's troubling because Eston and Winston now have the feeling that they were taken advantage of because of that, where the officer could have responded in kind and said, you know what, this is an educational opportunity for these young men. I'm going to give some kind of educational opportunity for that and have a positive interaction. Eston and Winston now believe that they should not comply and that they should do whatever they can and comply with the law as far as they could, but after that, maybe not so much as comply with officers and get an attorney, one of the bad guys like me, and maybe not be so forthcoming. So it's one of those unfortunate situations where a positive interaction could have been handled very, very differently. The other type, so the other 2 things that I'll mention, just really briefly, is that everyone else in the blind either had their cases dismissed or were pled out in something that did not result in 20 or more points. I think it's one of the, it's worth mentioning. I don't know that it actually has any merit here, but it is worth mentioning. Eston and Winston are stand-up gentlemen. They're young men. Eston is 22 years old, and Winston is 17. They have both expressed nothing but remorse for the incident. They have always held CPW in high regard. They wish this incident had gone differently. It has left them with a sour taste in their mouth, and that this interaction that could have been positive and they tried to make positive wasn't positive. And I think that's kind of what we're standing here today on. Do you guys have any questions for me before I turn it back over to Mr. Cooley?
Mr. Gilbert, I think what we'll do is let Mr. Gilbert, Mr. Cooley's talk, and then if their commission has questions for any of you, we'll have you come back up. So if you wouldn't mind just taking a chair there in the front, Mr. Cooley.
Before I begin, I would like just to address one correction in the request for commission review for Winston McGraw. I just noticed that at the top, it does inaccurately say that he received a 2-year decision. Winston McGraw, in fact, only received a 1-year decision, okay? So just a clarification on that. In both cases, the suspension is reflective of the wildlife violations and the lack of remorse or an acceptance and accountability and the disregard for private property rights of another person. The inappropriate statements made towards a landowner and the representative don't necessarily have to be proven. They were both acknowledged, or it was acknowledged by both parties during the hearing that somebody made this comment. The comment was attempted to be downplayed as, well, we were just saying, you know, wow, an accident could happen if somebody came over here when we had guns. However, looking at it, it doesn't seem to be have been made in that manner. It does seem to be something that was kind of meant to intimidate the landowner or, at least in some manner, come across as threatening. I certainly would have taken it that way. When the party was initially confronted by the landowner and representative, no reasonable action was taken to ensure that they were actually hunting on that property. Yes, they say that they got on the website and looked at the county assessor to see if they were on that property. Well, there's no way of determining on a county assessor website exactly where you're at. You do need a GPS to determine where they're at. OnX is quite frankly the only system that I'm aware of that has got those landowner boundaries on it, so I do bring it up during hearings. I'm not telling people to buy that product, but it is something that is certainly handy, particularly in small areas like this where property lines can come down to 0.02 or 35 yards. But they didn't really take it any further than that in trying to determine where they were at. Due to the floods in the area, there were no fence lines, there was no definitive boundaries in the area to determine where people were at without some sort of a GPS. And instead of looking at this a little more seriously in terms of what the landowner is saying, hey, you're on my property, and moving it to where they knew they would be back on the river bottom hunt property, they took no action and did not move it until the officer actually came along with the GPS and said, you are on someone else's property, you need to move the blind. And yes, they did cooperate. During the hearing, instead of accepting any responsibility for their actions or offering any sort of remorse, the McGraws stated that Nelson was actually the one trespassing and was on River Bottom Hunt Club property when they confronted the hunting party and questioned what would constitute hunter harassment. At no point did the hearing did I hear any sort of remorse from either party saying, I'm sorry, we screwed up, we accept, but they did accept responsibility for their actions, I will say that. The petition to review references that all of the defendants in this case had their cases either dismissed or received a plea bargain to a violation that did not meet the minimum standards for a suspension. This is not correct. 2 of the hunters that had been invited to hunt the River Bottom Hunt property that were cited for trespass were noticed to suspension hearings following pleas of violations of 20 points or more. Only 1 of the 5 individuals cited in this incident actually received a plea bargain from the court for a violation less than 20 points. I did take into account the lack of necessarily malicious intent for these violations, particularly when it comes to Eston McGraw. I don't necessarily, it's not my stance that he intentionally went out without a hunting license or intentionally went out with an unplugged shotgun. However, it is a responsibility of a sportsman to ensure that they are properly licensed, and that was negligent in his case not to do so. I would ask respectfully that the commission uphold the initial decision of 2-year suspension for Mr. Eston McGraw and the 1-year suspension for Mr. Winston McGraw. I'll go ahead and open it up for any questions you might have.
Thank you, Mr. Cooley.
I just say if the other
ahead,
individuals had the suspensions and the notice suspensions, that was news to me. Stand corrected.
Thank you, Mr. Gilbert. Commissioners? Mr. Wingfield.
I think there's a lesson in any of this here. Just a little bit of respect to the landowners that were offended. We wouldn't be here. I mean, they wouldn't have turned you in. They wouldn't have called the wildlife officer. And in the case of the McGraws or the previous case there, If they'd have just said, oh, I'm sorry, we'll script, we'll get it moved, they wouldn't have pressed charges and you guys wouldn't have got anything. So, you know, as a landowner, most of us are in here, we don't go out and want to yank people's licenses. We just want to say, well, you're not supposed to be here. And if they say, sorry about that, and we're out of here, and sometimes we're good friends. But that's the one thing. You're not in the open area there. There's landowners. Take care of them, because we need all the landowners to help us with our wildlife too. So a little bit of respect to the landowner. You guys wouldn't even be here. We wouldn't be messing around.
Commissioner Vehil.
I have a question. Do we take these one at a time, or are we going to lump them together? Because they are two different appeals.
Mr. Chair,
Counsel, that would be helpful if you
yes,
could comment.
would you please provide two separate motions for each individual? One,
Yeah,
you know what I mean?
that's fine.
Thank you, Counsel. And thank you for that question, Commissioner Vehil.
Okay. I'm ready to make a motion if
Commissioner
there are
Vehil.
no questions.
Commissioner Zip.
Just a question for Mr. Cooley. So, just to clarify on the Eston McGraw with the total of the 40 points, the 2-year suspension, given these violations and number of points, is that on the low, mid, upper range? Is it kind of typical? I know it's not always easy to compare, not necessarily comparing apples to apples, but in general, for these violations and the number of points, is a 2-year suspension, where does that fall in the range?
The given range for suspension for these violations is 0 to 5 years. It's taking the easy way out. I would say this is perfectly in line with other cases that I have seen, both historically and of my own cases, where negligence is involved and there are some actions involved that certainly are not representative of what we would expect of a sportsman. If anything, it is perhaps a little on the light side. It is 40 points, it's 4 violations. There were some aggravating factors involved here. But I did try to look at not only both parties, Eston and Winston's age and experience, but also their intent in this crime or criminal activities as to, you know, were they intentionally trying to do these acts? And I think that the 2 years is reflective and is perfectly in line with those others that I've seen.
Thank you.
Commissioners, why don't we deal with, Mr. Gillard, I know you have a client sitting next to you. Does he want to address us, or how?
My client would just want to make clear that when they were approached by the landowner, the environment created by the landowner or the landowner's daughter, as it was not a friendly confrontation. The landowner did not come over and politely ask that they leave and intentionally say, you know, please, would you, you know, get off our property, that it was them who escalated the situation in the first place. That's the only other thing that I would like to say in kind of response to Commissioner Zip's question is to take into account what you heard before. The first appeal that we heard this morning, where no cooperation was given whatsoever by the individual, and he received a 3-year suspension, whereas my clients were completely and 100% in compliance with the officer's directions in every command, and received a 1-year suspension less than the individual we already heard this morning. I think that was a stark contrast between the two cases that I obviously just became aware of this morning.
Thank you. Why don't we deal with the Eston McGraw case first? Commissioner Vehil.
I'll make a motion, we deny the appeal.
Second from Commissioner Haskett. Any further discussion? Adrian, please call the roll.
Bray?
Yes.
Haskett? Hauser? McDaniel? Peisel? Spahar?
Yes.
Vehil?
Yes.
Wingfield?
Yes.
Zimmerman? Zip?
Yes.
And Chairman Howard.
Yes.
Motion carries unanimously.
Our next case then is Winston McGraw. Need a motion from one of the commissioners. Oh, I'm sorry. Thank you, Commissioner Bray.
I make the motion, we deny the appeal.
Second from Commissioner Zip.
Bray?
Yes.
Haskett? Hauser?
Yes.
McDaniel?
Yes.
Peisel?
Yes.
Spahar?
Yes.
Vigil?
Yes.
Wingfield?
Yes.
Zimmerman?
Yes.
Zip?
Yes.
And Chairman Howard?
Yes.
And Haskett, that was a yes. Please, yes. Motion carries unanimously.
Thank you, gentlemen.
Thank you for your time.
Next up is the consent agenda. And Commissioner Bray, we had several discussions around the consent agenda, and could you just articulate for me what you would like to do today on those?
Yeah,
three?
I'm willing to place them back on the consent agenda. I would like to just have my fellow commissioners, in the narrative on both those plans, in the back of the narrative, there's some biological and factual statements that are provided for evidence, and quite frankly, I found them very interesting. I think they're very educational. There's some charts there that would show the correlation between game population numbers and hunter success and whatnot, and it's very educational. I think they were a little bit overlooked in the presentation. They were kind of an appendix of what the staff used to make their decisions, and they're very educational. And I would like to request that at a future meeting we have a presentation by staff on some of those. And let me get to them, and I'll if I can get to the consent agenda here.
Which one are you?
The ones I'm referring to were the deer ones that are on the.
Yeah, I realize that, but all of them? Is that, or just one of the
Well,
three?
the two that were presented by the same biologist have the same appendix. And I just wanted to point out, those are very valuable information, very educational for us, and they were kind of glossed over. And I would like a presentation by staff. It's an educational opportunity for us to really understand how they arrive at some of these things.
Please go ahead, Greg.
For the record, I'm Craig McLaughlin, the Terrestrial Section Manager. Commissioner Bray, we could certainly do that. I'm sensing that you have some considerable interest in the science behind our planning process.
Exactly.
And you would like to understand that better?
I would like to understand that better. I think we're all armchair biologists from time to time, but I've been around a long time. 1996, I was the landowner representative to the Big Lap community. And John Ellenberger was the staff representative to that committee. And we met for a year and a half monthly, and was presented by staff science and studies and from all aspects. And it was hugely beneficial for us to understand game management and how licenses affect that and whatnot, and these habitat programs. And there's a particular graph there, and I apologize, I can't find it right now, but there's a particular Bell graph in that narrative that would suggest that hunter success at 3,000 animals would be the same as it would be if there were 15,000 animals out there on the landscape. That's pretty good information, right, folks, and it'd be helpful to really delve deeper and understand. And I think it'd be an educational thing for us and the public that's listening to delve a little deeper, just have a 30-minute seminar on some of those, I think would be real helpful. And
I will leave it to the director and the chairman to determine perhaps the best approach there, but we as staff are more than willing to help you understand the science that we use.
well, I think it'd really help us in the future. Why maybe we wouldn't ask you so many dumb questions when the time comes. So.
And the chair would welcome having that on the agenda, so.
Just for
Mr. Director, it would be up to you.
Yeah, Mr. Chair, I think I'm hearing you correctly, is just kind of an overview, not anything specific to any unit, but just a very broad but general discussion about the science behind the planning and the decision, the licensing, and absolutely, I think it'd be great.
Commissioner Zimmerman.
Can I just clarify, is it the Appendix B, the population dynamics, maximum sustained yield, density dependence, that discussion?
That's one of them, but there's 2 or 3 reports there
No,
that are absolutely, I don't know if the other commission members had a chance. I read them in great detail, and I'm a little slow sometimes. I need further explanation, I guess, but I found it fascinating, really, and it really does reflect on your thought process of how you analyze these things.
Outstanding, thank you for that. Why don't we deal, unless there are any other changes, with the consent agenda, and then I have a couple of things, I think we have the time that I'd like to just go over with the commission. They're relatively minor process things, but I'd like to get some input on. So, if someone could give me a motion on the Commissioner Zimmerman.
Second.
Commissioner Zimmerman has moved the consent agenda, seconded by Commissioner Vigil. I think we can do this by voice vote. All those in favor, please say aye.
Aye. Aye.
Any opposed? Thank you very much. I had a suggestion. Let me back up. With everything going on, I have not been as focused on some of the kind of looking at how we could do things maybe differently and efficiency. And so I had a couple of ideas come in and kick me a little bit to be thinking about that. And one of them, which I've already talked to Adrian about, and Adrian, I think I'm not misstating this when you said this was a wonderful idea for you. So the theory was a little bit around email. We get a lot of email, and that's a great thing, but sometimes it can kind of take over. And I, for one, sometimes can't find the email that I read, that had the doodle poll that I needed to fill out from 3 days ago. And so the suggestion really was, could Adrian sift her weekly emails to us to get the vast majority of them, which are really administrative and helpful to us, very necessary, but they're not white-hot urgent. And could she send those out, say, on a Friday? And then the important things would come as usual throughout the week. But that would give us one sort of document to look for if you know you need some information from the prior week or several weeks ago. It helps Adrian in that she only has to get one email out. And what I would just propose, if the commission's okay with this, is that I'll just work with Adrian and staff to get through all the detail, and we'll go over to that process. I just figured if suddenly the email shut down and you started getting a weekly newsletter, you might be concerned. So that's why I'm bringing up such detail. But any thoughts on that, or?
I think it makes sense, Commissioner Howard, to not get 2 or 3 updates on an item or something like that, and just to give a chance for everything to accumulate and get out at a single date is fine with me. Yeah.
So Adrian, if that's okay, you and I will take that on. Yeah. Great. I have a couple other things, but I also want to use this time if commissioners would like to come up with some other ideas. This is a great forum for talking about it. One thing I wanted to talk about is, of course, we have our technology evangelist, Southeast Regional Manager Prenslow, and I got a chance to go down to his Sportsman's Roundtable, and it, to my surprise, was broadcast on Facebook Live. And it was moderated, and I was super impressed with how staff handled it. And the numbers, we had a standard Sportsman's Caucus of, I think, about 30 folks. And then we had, I think, several thousand people on Facebook Live. And so and this is not a decision point or anything, I just wanted to say to the commission, if staff could make it happen, and there are challenges to doing this, bandwidth, the camera placement, all those types of things, but would the commission have interest in doing that? Or are there concerns? How would you, could we have a little discussion on that? And I would welcome staff's input as well.
Well,
Commissioner Hauser.
Thank you for the opportunity, and I just in absolute full transparency, I will admit to being the one to approach Chairman Howard and talk a little bit about the email efficiency, and happy to be part of that solution. Never want to suggest a problem, and I also want to just acknowledge Adrian for getting for what I believe is all the best intent to get us information as quickly as she can. And if she can think like a commissioner as it's landing in our box all day, and not just from Adrian. I mean, if there's also a way for you to coordinate a little bit with some of the other folks that send us important stuff, I just, I feel like I could do my job better. Maybe others agree with that. So I just wanted to offer that disclosure. And Chairman Howard and I talked a little bit about the Facebook Live thing last night, and we attempt this also in our world up in the mountains. And I think what's important is, one, setting a precedent if it's something that we try, because if you can't do it another time, that could become tricky. It does require some pretty significant bandwidth. We could pilot it and perhaps say it's a pilot. Or disclose that, we might try to do it whenever the technology allows. That'd be my only concern is to get folks accustomed to being able to dial in this way, and then it doesn't work, or it can be spotty depending on, they have to kind of re-up and, all that stuff. So that's just the only thing is, you want to bring some, obviously, your technology gurus in and think about where we might be geographically and if there's actually the capacity. I mean, I look at the Jimmy job that we do occasionally on conference calls, and I don't know that's those are two things go together. So just my thoughts, and happy to offer our experience in attempting some of these things to the extent that's helpful.
And as I say, I don't think I'm looking for any decision today. I just wanted to start a discussion. I think it's probably important that some of you go back and think about it, because there are I can see negatives to it beyond just the logistics. But so if that's okay, if I could have you percolate on that idea until the next meeting, and then we'll talk about it again. And obviously, we welcome staff's input.
Yeah, Mr. Chair, I think that's a great idea. I think the other thing we can explore is like Facebook Live can be somewhat interactive, but what we hear is the other criticism is I can't drive to Denver, or I can't drive to that part of the state and make a comment or address an agenda item. That I think if there's a way we can allow public input remotely, much like the legislature does right now, is you could walk into just about anywhere and they would throw you up on the screen and allow you to interact with the commission virtually, I guess, that maybe that's a component we can look as well as the other side of public involvement and engagement side of that. So I think it's a great idea. I think we can sit down with our folks as well as OIT and just see what we can do. And if we can't do it, what's it going to take to get it done?
And I wouldn't, just as a suggestion, Director, I wouldn't invest a huge amount of time until the commission says that they really do want to pursue it. But if you can look at it at a high level, perhaps, and that would be really helpful. Gotcha. Last thing I wanted to suggest, we've been talking about GOCO quite a bit. We've in the past had a joint dinner. I think that would be a good idea, Director, if we could I'm not certain, of course, now we're leaving Denver, so that always changes things, but I would certainly like to try and do something with the GOCO board included, if we can do that. And I'm assuming other commissioners would be, the older commissioners, we've done it before, so, and I think it's been too long, probably. So, if anyone has any other ideas or thoughts, we certainly welcome them. If we can make, if we can support commissioners, better. I know staff is always anxious for that, and it may seem sometimes that, oftentimes what I find on some of these issues is staff is waiting for us to ask. And so if you've got efficiency areas, my experiences are very happy to hear it and love to hear it. So, any other thoughts? Great. All right. great. That's a perfect introduction then to the GOCO update with Emily. No, I didn't. But.
I think that's a great idea, Mr. Chairman, and I know we talked a little bit about that at our committee meeting last week, and the last meeting was in January of 2016, which was a pretty lively commission meeting, if you guys remember back then, so it wasn't necessarily the most robust dinner conversation. I think people were a little tuckered out. Anyway, thank you so much. I'm excited to be here with you this morning, and I'm going to keep my update really brief since we did talk a lot yesterday. Since we're in Denver, there it is. I always like talking about Staunton. Staunton's an important in the GOCO and CPW story. GOCO began investing in Staunton in the early 90s with initial investments for acquisition, and we make ongoing operations and maintenance investments nearly every year, and this year's investment proposal we have some exciting additional capital projects, which includes investments in phase 2 of park developments, which is a lot of continuing road work and parking lot construction, which if you've been up there on the weekends is much needed. Vault toilets, signage, and improvements to the equestrian parking lot, which I think will be really helpful to that user group. And this picture of these fat bikes down here, the park hosted its first fat bike race a couple weekends ago when we actually did have a little bit of snow, and it was overwhelmingly successful. There was over 60 riders, so I know that the GOCO was excited to help support and promote that event. I know that I've talked about this for the last 2 meetings, but we have 5 newly minted conservation leaders for tomorrow at GOCO, including 1 board member. So this is a picture, and I think that angle is what makes that picture not the greatest. But this picture of Jackie Miller, our youth programs director, and regional manager Dorsey, and then executive director Castillion there with his 9 pheasants that he shot on the last day. And I did want to read a comment from Chris Ewan Farrell, who's on our open space team, about his experience there. He said, as a non-hunter with a background in ecology, I consider the science behind hunting as a wildlife management strategy credible and sound. Conservation Leaders for Tomorrow provided the framework and support necessary to galvanize my convictions and broaden my understanding of the sportsman as a conservationist. I now feel better equipped to pursue hunting as a personal endeavor and to champion hunting as a strategy in my professional life. So thank you, Director Broscheid, for helping establish that partnership, and we're excited to see where we go in years 2 and 3. As we talked about yesterday, the GOCO board is meeting next week in Estes Park. We have a mini retreat day on Wednesday where we will be discussing policies, and I did, after thinking about yesterday's robust conversation, want to add that GOCO and CPW should have a strong relationship regardless of who's in any of these positions. So I did get his permission before committing him, but Justin and I, we're committed to working together to build a strong foundation, everything from governing documents to job descriptions, but especially in that MOA, to make sure that who's ever in these positions 5 years from yesterday, as Director Castillion pointed out, will be even more successful than we are. So this relationship shouldn't be built on personalities. We should create the foundation to make it even more successful in the future. And then we'll move into a working meeting on Thursday where our board will review and approve funding for our competitive programs. All of our annual ongoing programs for the local government quadrant will be reviewed, and that includes our local parks and outdoor recreation program, planning, and mini program grants. And our local government team received over 90 applications at the beginning of this year, and those projects are really the spectrum, everything from rodeo grounds in Nucla to pickleball courts, which we keep seeing more and more of, to everything in between, ball fields and skate parks. The board will also be reviewing our schoolyard applications as well. The spring board meeting is typically when the board reviews Colorado Parks and Wildlife's annual investment proposal, and this year is no different. The board will be reviewing requests of $18.3 million for the parks purpose and $16.3 million for wildlife purpose. And that wildlife request includes close to $3 million for additional dam construction and maintenance work, $1 million for wildlife crossings, funding for habitat work on the western slope, and $2 million to establish a wildlife small capital program, which I think will be really helpful to this conversation that we're having collectively about backlog and ongoing maintenance. And finally, I wanted to let you all know that one of the things that we're hopeful to do this year with our CPW committee and the board in general is really highlight programs that GOCO hears about but may not be directly involved with funding in or work with through our competitive programs. So at our committee meeting, we were pleased to have Pat Tucker join us to really dive into the habitat protection program and just looking to broaden our understanding of what Parks and Wildlife does outside of where we overlap with GOCO. So I'm hoping to have Ranching for Wildlife discussions and other types of program 101s. And if there's any suggestions that you'd like GOCO to know more about, we're absolutely wide open to having those presentations at the committee level. And finally, we'd like to invite you all, as always, to our community event next week in Estes Park on March 14th. We're having a little happy hour, and I will send Adrian the details. But would love it if you happen to be in that neck of the woods for you to join us. And speaking of Facebook Live, I meant to show this Facebook Live last meeting. It's about 7 to 10 minutes long, so I'm not going to show it to you today, but our respective marketing and communications teams are really working to beef up our Facebook Live cross promotion. So this was a Facebook Live event in December that highlighted some habitat restoration work up at Pruitt Reservoir that GOCO funded through Ducks Unlimited and CPW. And you're right, the numbers on those Facebook Live events are unbelievable and really popular. So I think our respective teams are looking to do at least one event quarterly, but they're really popular. And finally, a brief lottery reauthorization update. I want to thank the Commission for the resolution that you passed in support of reauthorization last month, and thank Chairman Howard again for his op-ed in the Pueblo Chieftain. The bill has made it out of the Senate, which is exciting, and it's scheduled for its first reading in the House on March 19th in the House Finance Committee. So again, if you're interested in almost real-time updates, this website, you can sign up for the newsletter, really good communication tool, and also where you can add your name to the list of supporters if you haven't already, and that's keepitco.org. That's all I have for you today.
Emily, I have a question. I got my email last night from Michelle Frischman, who was here yesterday, one of our GOCO staffers, and she's setting up the annual site visits. And I went on my first one last year. There's a lot of opportunity there. There is no way Commissioner Zimmerman and I can, cover all of those that would be relevant to CPW. And yet I thought it was a super valuable experience. I actually gave up a day of big game hunting to do it, and it was worth it.
That's how valuable they are.
So I'm just wondering, is it something where other commissioners, I don't want to cause another regulatory analysis that we have to do, but could other commissioners, particularly if a site visit was in their area, could they go along? Because I was really impressed with staffs. I got to see staff recommend a project and why they chose not to recommend it, and I thought it was super valuable.
Absolutely, and you bring up a good point. I want to introduce Michelle Frischman, our open space manager. She's here again today, and Dylan Luan is here as well. One of the things, in addition to bringing CPW to our meetings, is that GOCO staff is interested in becoming more aware of your operations, so you might see some new GOCO faces over the course of the year. But yes, absolutely, that's no regulatory issues on our end for inviting the commission to those. And in fact, Commissioner Vigil and I have talked about our upcoming site visit to a project down in his neck of the woods, but we are happy to invite the commission to the entire slate of those visits or to ones just specifically in your region. Absolutely.
Well, if we could get an official, I mean, Matt is always very efficient on email with his doodle polling and all that, so if we could somehow work with Adrian to get those dates to the commissioners, that'd be great.
Absolutely.
Thank you very much. Commissioners, any questions or comments for Emily? Great. Oh, sorry, Commissioner Vigil.
I just want to remind you that I need the audit.
Yes,
Copy, please.
it's on my to-do list.
All right. It's a long list. Don't put it way at the bottom.
Now it's on record. It's on my short-term to-do list.
Thank you.
Thanks very
Thank
much,
you.
Emily. Why don't we go ahead then with Mr. Chick on the IPAWS update. Welcome, Corey.
Good morning. Morning, Commissioners, Director, Corey Chick, License and Pass Section Manager. If I can just give a brief IPAWS update as it relates to draw and then kind of everything that we have going on. Looking at this topic, most things fall within pretty much three categories. Either the testing that we're doing on the system upgrades and fixes, or outreach and customer service. As far as the testing, this is something that we do every single year with the system, regardless of this being a new system. We always run test draws every single year to make sure that the functionality exists. A lot of this is in coordination with both OIT and the vendor. And it's our stopgap to make sure that the draw always runs as flawlessly as possible. So, we also have multiple meetings with our vendor weekly where we discuss issues, make sure everyone's on the same page. And again, that's in coordination both. A lot of times that's CPW, OIT, and the vendor all in the same room. As far as system upgrades and fixes, a lot of the changes come on a whim. They're either incorporated by hot fixes or some are code fixes that we go through and coordinate that with OIT. Some of the big changes that we've made here in the last month that solved a great deal of our issues was changing our login page. The system is now we're no longer requiring a unique email address. So when you log in on the website, you're using an identifier, so it's something like your CID number or your driver's license number, passport number. This got us around a lot of issues that we were having with folks not being able to get into the system due to that duplicate identifier issue that we were having. From what I'm hearing from numerous folks, customers, this fix actually made the system work a lot smoother. So we were glad to incorporate that. Since the last meeting, also, we've hired 5 temps that are now housed over in my shop that are working on merges. So we're trying to get through as many of those as we can. We also are working with our vendor and their call center. This is a big change for them as well. They're handling a lot more business that they normally did not handle. So what we're going to do, and I've talked to Lauren, but we're going to work hand in hand with them and actually start listening to some of those calls because we are getting some complaints from customers. So we're going to start listening to those calls with the vendor and then be able to coach their call center to help out and to be able to give the level of customer service we think their call center should be given. So, and that should start, I believe, next week. So hopefully that goes well as well. And then the last with outreach and customer service, and this is probably where my laundry list lies, because there's a lot we're trying to do, and we're trying to reach out and touch as many of our customers as we can so they they're well-versed in our system, and there's not, at least we limit the amount of user error that we're getting. So a lot of that we're tackling on our website, and that's either by pop-ups or Crystal Egley has, she's made videos on how to apply, and then we've had to change those again in this last month when we changed the login page, but she's been great to work with, and I think those are a benefit to the customer on how to get in, not only get into the system, but also apply for the draw. I've now apparently become a celebrity. I've been on 4 or 5 radio shows. I find those very beneficial. I think we're, again, trying to reach as many people as we can. We're answering those questions that our customer have. And again, hopefully just trying to make this change easier. Chairman Howard, you mentioned Facebook Live. I actually have one of my staff, I believe next week, is going to be doing exactly that on how to apply in the draw. So hopefully that works out well, and I think it's in one of the sportsmen's groups that's putting that on. So hopefully it reaches exactly who we want to, and that helps out as well. Commissioner Spahar, I believe at last commission meeting you had mentioned, and it was a good idea, you know, is there a way that we could reach those customers that potentially have merged accounts that applied in last year's draw? I had the vendor run a report on that, so we ran the report on applied in last year's draw, and were potential merge customers. There turned out to be 194,000 of them that had unique emails. So we sent out an email blast to those customers, asking them, get on now. If there's any issues, we can fix them prior to the draw deadline. I am hoping that worked very well. I know we've had an influx in calls in our call center, and of course my staff dealing with merges, so hopefully we can, or at least that will help the process. So appreciate that. We are extending, or well, at least we're in the talks right now. I've talked to Lauren about it a little bit, and then Brad at the call center. We're looking at extending our office hours near the deadline, the big game draw deadline. Typically what we do is we would normally just stay till midnight the night of. I think what we're looking at is extending those hours a little bit in the couple nights leading up to that, so that way if there's, we know a good majority are going to hit us in those last 3 days, and I guess to make it short, that's what we're going to plan for. So my staff is also not only to the normal 8 to 5 Monday through Friday. We have an on-call 8 to 5 Saturday and Sunday as well to help staff out with any issues that they have. That will continue until it's not needed. Hopefully through this big rush of camping and the draw as well. So, and then also the last thing I'll mention as far as what we're really trying to do is Devin, y'all have met her, the IPAWS coordinator. She sends out a weekly digest of tips and tricks, and this is what's changed in the system. I got a good idea, I believe, from Brad Henley through Dan. We might even extend that to be a weekly call with staff, so that if there's questions or tips and tricks they've learned or things that we can address right there. So that's something else we're looking at. And then the last thing I'll touch on, this is about 1/3 of what we do, actually less than that in the section. If you don't look at the hearings or the mailroom, this is about 1/3. The other thing is, of course, the day-to-day duties that my folks are handling, as well as, you know, we also have the pass side of this and the reservation side of this, which is very important. That was probably the biggest change for this agency, in that on the hunt and fish side, we have had an automated system. On the pass and reservation side, well, we had a automated system for the reservation, but not the pass. So we're still working through a lot of those issues, and we've done draws for years, and I've yet to see one go 100% smooth, but they always go, and they always go 100% correct, or at least close to that. And then there's always those few that we pick up after that we do hand draws and things like that for. But with that, I'll open it up to any questions.
Commissioner Bray.
Thank you, Corey. That's a great report. My question regarding landowner vouchers and how they fit into the system, are we still doing paper, or how are we doing those?
Currently, right now, those are still paper, Commissioner Bray. We are looking at, and that was something I talked with the outfitter board on, because I believe there's one member on the cattlemen's on there, and I would like to get on their agenda. Just, I think that's one of the lessons that we've learned out of this, is that when we incorporate something like this, it's better to know what everyone needs, not just what we think they need. We do, or would like, and have a plan to go paperless on those as well. I think the earliest we could look at that is probably 2019. This is also something we would do in concert with OIT and the vendor. So IPAWS has taken up everyone's time. So there really was no free time related to that program, but it's on the docket, I guess.
Thank you. I fully support that. I'm not in any push for that. I just appreciate the update.
Sure. Commissioner Spahar.
Thanks, Corey, for following up on the merged merged application issue. I guess I don't know whether to be surprised or not at the 194,000 number. I mean, were you, or?
I actually thought it was a little low. I would have expected, at least what I was expecting it would have been a little bit higher. I was thinking it was going to be around the 250, 300,000 mark, especially when you look at the reservation and the hunt and fish side, because we looked at, yeah, I mean, it's a big report. I mean, it's running across better than 1 million customers. So I think part of that is that we jumped on it as quick as we could. We did have them do an auto merge on those customers that just had one hunt and fish and one reservation account or camping account. This ran just more on the hunt and fish side, and those that had a unique email address.
Well, hopefully it was worth the effort.
It was.
I appreciate that you followed it.
Sure.
Commissioner Haskett. And can I just say, I know Commissioner Haskett's been helping out with feedback. She's getting a lot of feedback, so we appreciate that, Commissioner Haskett.
Thank you. I just want to say thank you for all the time you put into this, and thanks for the recent changes. I think that'll make a big difference.
Thank you.
Other comments or questions? Oh, yeah, absolutely, Director.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Nothing on IPAWS, just a thanks to Corey's leadership and the entire staff. You know, usually when problems get resolved, you kind of take your foot off the pedal a little bit and start coasting. We're doing the opposite. It's keeping the pedal down and going. So I really appreciate that. The other is, so not only do you have problems with your own system and trying to work a lot of kinks out, just for the folks that are here or listening at home, we became aware of some misleading websites out there now that are proposing to sell hunting and fishing licenses, and they look legit, apparently. Some people are buying them. And so we became aware of this through AFWA, or Association of Fish and Wildlife Agencies, and most of the states look like they're in the South and the Midwest. There's a whole list of them from Florida, Georgia, South Carolina, and it looks like even Wyoming is starting to see some of this. But these are websites that are something.org. Just to remind people, if you're going to buy a hunting and fishing license, you come to our website. It should be .gov. It should be Colorado Parks and Wildlife. And what it is $19.99, and they say they're buying a license, and what they're getting is an informational brochure. So this is pretty serious, as you know. It's a lot of complaints that are coming into those states, and we're keeping an eye out for that. There's not much we can do, but Federal Trade Commission's getting involved in this. So this is a big deal, and there's a lot of angry folks out there, and there's a lot of basically fraud going on. So now we got to keep an eye out for attacks from the outside coming in. So just to remind our folks, our entire leadership team, the licensing unit's aware, but it's really coming down to customer buyer beware. If it's a .org, do not go to it. Come to our website.
Commissioner Zimmerman.
Do we have a banner or anything that when you go to our website that says, you know, be aware of other things, like this is the place to buy it, and, or I don't know. You know,
Yeah.
sometimes you go to those, like for example, like my Bank of America or something like
Right.
that, or Wells Fargo, it'll say, you know, please note, like, IRS is never going to call you, or, you know, Bank of America, we're never going to send you an email like this. You're always going to have to come to our site and log in.
Yeah, and I think that's a great comment, and we are. I think we need to get a lot more information. This is just a kind of a heads up. I think we'll talk about it more in 2 weeks at the North American, but Recreational Boating and Fishing Foundation is getting involved as well. And they're going to kind of put together that sort of a communication package that can send to all of the states that we can all then use and be consistent on that. But yeah, it's tough when people have to come to you. I think when we get iPaws up and running, I think now we can send alerts out to our customers once we get that established. So I think that's the ultimate goal. Yeah. So, thank you.
Well, Corey, I just wanted to congratulate you. It seems to me like November 2016, you were at that podium and said public speaking was not your first talent, perhaps. I can't remember how you put it. And now you're a media celebrity. So I think one of the great things about sitting here, there's so many wonderful things about being a commissioner and the honor of being a commissioner. But, you know, watching staff conquer these problems and personally grow, I'm not sure it gets any better than that. So
Thank you.
good luck for the next few months.
All right. Thank you.
I believe next is our much-awaited legal report.
It is, but can I seize this opportunity to introduce you to a couple of new faces in the AG's office before we get into the...
Absolutely.
It's not an understatement to say that we're thrilled to have two new people in the AG's office working full-time for Parks and Wildlife. We received a very high level of interest in these two positions, and I think it's fair to say that, not putting words in Lisa Reynolds' mouth, my boss, but she got the cream of the crop in both candidates who she was absolutely seeking. Their names are Mitra Pemberton and Michelle Logan. They're both here with us today. Michelle's in the front, and Mitra's in the back behind Lisa there.
Why don't we have Lisa and everyone come forward so we can see you, if you don't mind.
Mitra is a 2006 graduate of the University of Colorado Law School. She spent her career in private practice at White & Jankowski doing primarily water law, representing municipalities and nonprofits in litigation and transactional matters. Michelle Logan is a 2003 graduate from Stanford Law School. Prior to law school, she was a wildlife technician for BLM and the U.S. Forest Service in Oregon. And after law school, she worked at the Department of Forestry in Oregon as their general counsel for 7 years, and moved to Colorado. Subsequently, was in private practice with Moses Wittemeyer in Boulder. So, like I said, we're extremely excited to have them join the team. Mitra will be doing a great deal of real estate work, and Michelle will be doing general counsel work for the commission as well as working closely with Lisa and the Department of Natural Resources on endangered species issues, which she is highly experienced in. So here they are.
Well, congratulations and welcome.
With respect to the executive session, Corey Chick just spoke to some of the issues. We, you know, at the last commission meeting, there was some question about gift licenses. So at my request, Adrian put sort of a placeholder on the agenda concerning executive session for a discussion of gift licenses. I'm not sure if that's necessary at this point or if that's something that the commission wants to talk in greater detail about in executive session. Just because it's on the agenda, we don't need to hold, don't necessarily need to hold an executive session. So if you want to hear more on that, we can do it. Yesterday, Director Broscheid talked about the claim of discrimination that the commission received within the last week or two by Bill and Brandon Martinez. As Director Broscheid said yesterday, we are conducting an investigation into those claims, which is in its infancy. Nick Lopez and Michelle Logan are looking into that and are here to discuss that in greater detail, the claims, the background, the allegations, the scope of our investigation, if that's something that the commission is interested in hearing at this point.
We are.
Okay. So if I can do my litany here and then invite you to request an appropriate motion. During the break, we'll go into executive session pursuant to the Open Meetings Act, Colorado Revised Statute, Section 246402-3A2, which allows the board to enter into executive session for conference with an attorney representing the board to discuss disputes that are the subject of pending or imminent litigation, or to discuss specific claims or grievances, or to receive legal advice on specific legal questions. The topic of executive session listed on the agenda will be a matter of discussion to receive legal advice concerning the 2018 IPAWS Agent Manual and group licensing procedures and questions, as well as to receive an update concerning the claims of discrimination made by Bill and Brandon Martinez concerning their licensing appeal process from January. So with that, I'd request you seek an appropriate motion to discuss those matters.
Commissioner Spahar.
Mr. Chairman, I move we go into an executive session for discussion of the matters outlined by Mr. Matter.
I'll second.
Thank you very much for that motion. Adrian, we have to do a roll call as I recall.
Yes, sir. Bray?
Yes.
Haskett? Yes. Hauser?
Yes.
McDaniel?
Yes.
Heisel?
Yes.
Spahar?
Yes.
Vigil?
Yes.
Wingfield?
Yes.
Zimmerman?
Yes.
Zip?
Yes.
And Chairman Howard.
Yes.
Motion carried unanimous.